Yeah, excellent. And let me just add to that I see science, philosophy, and there's not really an adequate term, theology, religion, spirituality, where those terms are evolving in themselves. But I see those as the science, philosophy, and religion, let's call it, the three legs of the stool of human knowledge, that each are indispensable, right? And that philosophy ideally serves to bridge and separate science and religion, bridging it by, that is acting as a mediator between them, but separating, like at the three legs of the stool, if the legs come too close together, the stool falls over, right? So if science tries to colonize philosophy or spirituality, then it ends up, going, it becomes, instead of being a source of greater human knowledge, it becomes a barrier to greater human knowledge, right? So
you beautifully, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but you just so beautifully described the role of the corpus callosum, which is both to unite and to divide and separate. Right. And I quote from the Upanishads as saying, at the middle of the heart there is the bridge that keeps the two worlds apart. A bridge keeps them apart. Beautiful. Carry on.
Yeah. So this idea that that theology can really help us both philosophically, scientifically, culturally. One of the ideas that I'm playing around with, I'll run it by you, is that the part of the reason that the human body is divided neurologically into these hemispheres is that it's a fractal representation of the structure of the universe as a whole. In other words, that as above, so below, right? It's a cliche, but the way I see it is that this motif of part and whole, right, which the left and the right represent so vividly, is really an expression of the whole of the universe, which I think of pantheistically as infinite and finite. The finite became a part of the infinite 13.8 billion years ago. And that motif of part and whole interacting, through evolution is refracted throughout the universe at every scale, like a fractal. So we can begin to see how the human body is an embodiment of this structure of emergence, not just in, the levels from, atoms to molecules to cells to organs to organism, but also in very important details like the way our brain is set up. So for example, why are there three primary values? Why not, we can have love in there. We don't want to put too much weight on the three. But for the same reason that there's three primary colors that can represent all the colors on our screen, right? Where there's three cones in our eye that give the ability to have RGB be the full spectrum. And I'd say there's three mental faculties in a basic human being, and that is feeling, thought, and will, right? And the good, the true, and the beautiful correspond to those faculties, which is why, that they can cover the waterfront and qualify the world, why they're the primary values like primary colors. So seeing, I think that we're on the cusp of a new realization of the significance of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and how these values are, in a sense, a threefold reflection of, infinite, finite, and evolution itself.
Yes, well, that was very rich. Thank you a lot there. And you'd be surprised how much of it I do agree with. I mean, you sounded like you were throwing something out. Not surprised. Particularly on the fractal element, because of course, in essence, we can see fractality everywhere in the physical world, but also, as you were quoting earlier, the embodied world is also a metaphor of a world beyond that. And there's two things here. The threeness, which is a very interesting topic, but the one I wanted to focus on is what you call whole and part, and I think that's absolutely right, and I call them that too. But for these purposes, I call them the force for division and the force for union. To me, probably the most, meaningful utterance of a profoundly wise man, Goethe, was his insight that the whole work of nature is dividing the united and uniting the divided. And he goes on to talk about it. But I think those forces do exist everywhere. And I even believe that the left and right hemispheres are instantiations of those drives that go beyond the living. So I don't think there is if I may just expand a little, I don't think there's a hard and fast barrier between the living and the unliving. So I think animacy is like inanimacy, but with the gain turned up enormously. So even the inanimate world actually can be responsive. It does respond to certain force fields, to certain elements. It recombines, it creates new architecture, it creates complexity, all of that. But what life does is to make all this 1,000-fold more possible, and particularly to respond to the drives towards goodness, beauty and truth, but also possibly this dividing and uniting element. So I've been in conversation a number of times, about over half a dozen now, but lately I had a conversation with Michael Levin, who's Professor of Developmental Biology at Tufts. And what he is, in a way, spearheading is a revolution in biology in which, belatedly, 100 years late, it catches up with physics. Physics found out that it wasn't enough to think of things as mechanical. In fact, in the end, nothing could be described in this way correctly. But biologists have gone on thinking of organisms as machines, which is a fundamental error. It doesn't mean that there is nowhere in those complex organismic structures that you can find a chain of causation, but that doesn't in itself make it a machine. So what I think he is now interested in is the point I made, that this left and right seems to come up in... He's doing something rather alarming, I think, but anyway, good for him. He's creating small, new, engineered organisms, and they find their way towards things that seem to be primal. And in a less disturbing realm, you can frustrate the development of an embryo in various ways. And amazingly, it can quite quickly find a way around the block to rejoin the path that it needed to be on, which is very odd because a mechanism can't do that. It has to have a notion of exactly what it is that it's doing here. So it's drawn by something, not just pushed from behind. Now, if that's the case, I think it's being drawn by these forces and form fields. That how does a tadpole know that its head has to reconfigure in 4 dimensions into the very different head of a frog? Where are these forms? They're certainly not in the DNA. So this is part of the problem we have, is that we have to take into account there are forces, there are drives, and everybody interesting in the 20th century thought there were forms and drives, Jung and Freud and so on. They weren't so stupid. I think these exist everywhere in the cosmos. So the cosmos is in evolution. You said earlier, all living things were in evolution. That is true. But I would say the cosmos is in evolution as well, from something very simple to something very complex and very beautiful and utterly creative. So the thrust behind the universe, if there's one word for it, it is creation, which is interestingly what we've always called it.
Indeed. Well, that's what Whitehead said, right? Creativity is the ultimate matter of fact, right? It's not the physical stuff.